Can you differentiate between desire and calling? Well, a good question. Interesting to think about. Desire can go in many different ways. And so just hearing the word makes me think of eros and the love connections. And so a person can have great desire and meaningful love connections that can be parallel to, but not identical with the calling. So, and we can have desires of many kinds that can enrich our life and expand our identity, but they're not necessarily calling. I like the old word longing, that we come into the world longing, and some people say we're longing for the paradise that we left, and that's a nice idea. And then other people say we're longing for something beautiful, we're longing for the beautiful. And I like that word longing, that it's going to be with us all along, that it makes us have a longer life, that we're longing. And in that longing is, the presence of calling. We're longing to be called to have a meaningful life because we didn't come here just to survive or simply to grow. We came here to become a fully conscious version of our own self. And when that happens, we find some satisfaction, but we also find ourselves being able to contribute something to other people, and in times like this, possibly contributing to the healing of the world. That's desire. That's longing. That's calling. Can you give an example of genius hiding near the wound? I don't really understand what that looks like. Okay, so we've done a lot of work with at-risk youth. And by the way, most youth are at risk these days because the world is at risk. And so when you're working, you could be working in a high school in a like a upper class area, where there's a lot of money is there in the high school, a lot of systems, a lot of teachers, a lot of support. And you can be working with young people there, and you can see some of their genius in the way some of them turn towards athletics and some turns towards academics and all the different things that young people do in order to grow and learn. But if you're working with at-risk youth, then they're not in the schools. They're not even in the system. They're in the streets. They're lost. They're homeless, or they're in gangs, whatever it is. They're messing with drugs. They're living la vida loca, the crazy life. And so you can't see them by their successes, because their successes look like crimes. So then you can only find their genius through the wounds. And I don't know, I just think of this one, we're working with these gangs in Chicago, and this one gang had a gang leader, really tough guy, unfortunately. I got to see how tough he was, and you could understand why he was the leader, but he was in pain, as most violent people are, as most conflicted people are. And he would have this way, he had authority in him that came out in the way he talked to people, which was just full of curses. And I began to focus on his cursing. And when I got to know him, I said, I figured something out about you. And he goes, what? I figured out that your genius is for language. He goes, what do you mean? I quit school. And I said, yeah, but you curse in a way that's almost Shakespearean. And he really got that. And he said, well, what do you mean? And I said, I think your genius is to use language. And I know you're tough, but actually people follow you because of the way you use language, and you curse in a way that is highly creative. And I think that that's where your genius lies. And I have to tell you that he wound up going to school, back to school, to college, and got some education in language, and became a mentor and a storyteller. So I hope that helps. But that can be true of anyone. It's just this idea deep inside us, related to each other, are the aspects of our own giftedness and our genius, and the aspects of our own woundedness. And it becomes really important in this sense. When a person responds to the call and begins to live the life of their own genius and their own inner spirit, then that life is not just taking another step into a way of being creative or innovative or inventive or whatever the style is. That step also requires some healing of the inner woundedness. people carry both gifts and wounds. Everybody does. And when you see a young person, a starlet, or a young musician, or the kind of rising stars in contemporary culture through music or through film or even through the internet, rising stars, you watch them rise and they're bright like a star rising, and then soon enough they're in trouble and they begin to fall because they hit their woundedness. And a person is always carrying the gifts and the wounds. And so the nature of being on the paths of calling is to be both responding to the capacity to grow and be more generative, but also being attentive to our own woundedness. You look at the people who rise up in political places in modern countries and all, with the return of the dictators and the strongmen. They can have a certain kind of power and maybe luck, but they're very wounded and they cause damage because they've never dealt with their woundedness. And a person who doesn't know their own wounds will wound other people and often not feel regret. What's the difference between despair from ignoring the calling and despair resulting from the echoes of trauma or mental health difficulties? Thank you for the question. I'm not really sure. I don't know what is exactly being meant by the trauma and mental health. I don't know that those two despairs are all that different. I think the despair from rejecting or dismissing the calling involves a descent into dark places and feeling lost. And so that can have a similar resonance to being in the dark places of trauma or struggling with mental health issues. I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. But I'll be thinking about it, and thank you for the question. A few days ago, a friend's adult son was found dead. How might those close to her best support her with such a devastation? Again, I'm sorry to hear that. When someone dies suddenly like that, it's a shock to their inner spirit, by the way, and it's a shock to everyone connected to them. And one thing that's problematic in the modern world, generally speaking, is people not knowing how to do funerals. And funerals used to be elaborate projects that involved the arts and poets and music and all kinds of things that were used in order to create vessels to hold the pain and the agony and all the loss, but also were the vessels that could then be turned and help guide people back to life. And so someone who has lost someone like that is pulled into, in ancient India, they call them the bardo realms. You're in some other realm and nothing makes sense and it can be all darkness. And so people need to be with them. But then the burial process and the funeral process becomes way more important than modern culture allows for. And just to say, you typically in ancient cultures, you wouldn't bury a person just once. In ancient China, for instance, 1 year, for an entire year, from the time a person dies until a year later, someone would be hired to walk at a distance from the person who lost the deceased, the person suffering the loss. Someone would be dressed in white and walking at some distance wherever they went, as a reminder that you're still walking with the person who has passed. It was a way of outwardly showing the inner loss. And then after a year, there would be another funeral. It's like you never finish really mourning the dead, but you have to find ways to continually let go of them. And so these tragedies happen to people typically, commonly, more often, really. And there is no practice for it that in any way meets the depth of loss and the layers of agony and the needs of a person who has lost someone like that. And so, best wishes for them and for the rest of us, realizing we're in a culture that doesn't recognize the inner qualities trying to awaken and doesn't recognize the levels of loss and pain that we can experience through the loss of those we love, or even losses in our own lives. And so all that stuff is waiting to be reimagined and rediscovered. And for instance, one of the ways in which the calling can come is to people who become doulas, or, death doulas. And the idea that people are learning again how to help other people die. That's a calling for some people. For some people, they couldn't handle it. Other people are called to that, and it makes sense to them. And so we are in a period of collapse and loss, which is, on the other hand, a period of awakening and renewal if we respond to the call. And I'm suggesting the calling is calling all the time.